This is the MeatEater podcast coming at you shirtless, severely bug-bitten, and in my case, underwearless.
We hunt the MeatEater podcast.
You can't predict anything.
The MeatEater podcast is brought to you by First Light. Whether you're checking trail cams, hanging deer stands, or scouting for elk, First Light has performance apparel to support every hunter in every environment. Check it out at firstlight.com. FIRSTLITE.com. Before I even introduce today's guest, I'm just going to get something awkward out of the way. Because people might be able to feel the awkwardness in the room between me and Chili.
Cut it with a knife.
I just had to.
It wasn't awkward until you decided to say something.
I didn't even know.
I just had to do an investigation on Chili. I had to subpoena his Onyx record.
Oh. What?
I had to subpoena.
No, you didn't subpoena nothing. I just gave it to you.
He could have subpoenaed you.
I subpoenaed his Onyx track. I was talking about a spot where I took Chili, and Chili's like, oh, you know, a little over west of there.
I'm waiting, yeah.
And get to looking, he's like, he thinks that if you take him to a spot, what becomes private is the route to get there, not the spot.
That's not true at all. That is not what I said.
Meaning, if there's a point on a map and you're like, well, we came in from the east, Chili would be like, okay, so if I come back with my buddies, I'll just make sure to go there from the west. But my investigation found that he was sort of correct. He was sort of in the okay.
But then sort of not.
Unless he said at this point I need to turn my tracker off.
If I ever show this to Steve, I need to stop
He paused his tracker for a minute and then went about his day and then clicked it back on. That's all. Just want people to be quiet. If they can feel at home, they might be able to feel the tension.
But Chili, change the body language. Look in the camera, make eye contact, because right now you're giving off a very guilty air about you.
Yeah, because I'm on Steve's show and he's ridiculing me.
Look the man in the eyes.
I gave you some intel.
You did. I appreciate that intel.
Yeah.
But you got it through crooked means.
That's not, no. It's subjective.
Defend yourself, Chili.
I was in a spot. So the intel is you were telling Steve about the deer that's in
He was telling me about some stuff from... No, he was telling me about some stuff that I'd never looked at.
Oh.
Yeah. So that's why I'm not mad, because now I'm glad that he told me that.
Oh, okay. And
what I might do is make you a little line.
Like, don't cross this line?
Mm-hmm.
Don't cross. Don't. You're gonna make me a line on public land, which I can't cross.
I'm not getting any. I'm not getting any like righteous indignation. I'm getting nothing from Cal. I'm watching Cal to see if he's got an opinion.
His eyebrows are about as high as they go.
I haven't heard enough from Chili to understand what the whole situation is. I mean, I'll tell you right now. I'm thinking about going into a spot for Thanksgiving that I know some people hunted in almost a decade ago, and they haven't walked in there. And I was talking about that with a buddy of mine, and he's like, well, let's just not bring that up.
I was thinking about explaining this. The other day I took my boy and, no, this is going to be a little... I took my boy and his buddy from high school to Seth's spot, and we gave my boy's buddy a real talking to about it.
Oh, good.
Wow.
Well, and he respects it.
Is this the first you're finding out about this?
No, he
Seth?
knows.
No, yeah.
We gave him a real talking to. And I almost went into, I was almost going to tell him like an added detail. I was saying, the situation you're in is this might prevent you from discovering something in the future that you would just know about on your own. Mm-hmm. So when you do that, you're sort of saying, well, I would have found out about that anyway, but now I can't.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I appreciated when we hunted with Cal's buddy a couple weeks ago. I met him maybe 5 minutes prior to him just looking me in the eyes and saying, I better not catch you in any of these places ever again without you asking me first.
Just get it out there right away.
I was given some
very frank.
I was given some very, very good intel 11 years ago to the 10-year point 11 years ago, and I would not dare do that unless I knew that those guys were dead.
Rick,
So
you have
is
thoughts?
all of this on public land?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you.
Very
But it's not like
It's a whole thing.
Okay,
It's a whole thing.
There,
Someone could write a book about it.
I do feel a little guilty. But one, we weren't hunting the same drainage, and two,
You were looking over into my zone.
you get on any top, you can see for miles on any ridgeline.
Some dude at home's like,
But and also, it's not like I brought more people in there. It's not like I brought anyone in there.
no, you brought the guy that I brought in there.
Yeah.
So it's like twice as bad.
How was that supposed to?
Because you both are morally bankrupt.
Or it could be half as bad because they're both splitting the sin.
They're
The
like,
the sin is divided
true.
amongst the two of
they're
them.
like, if two of us go, it's
Yeah.
like we're each being a little bad.
Yeah.
Instead of one whole thing.
Okay.
So, so that brings into question whether Onyx should post where all of the extremely high density hunting locations are to help people out, because there are locations all around the national park where you'd be shocked at how many people show up to the same spot every day, and hunt sometimes 50 yards from each other
Outside the park.
outside the park.
I saw some of that the other day.
And that's been going on for over 100 years.
Yeah.
Because as they expanded the park, they just moved that, that firing line out to the new boundary of the national park.
So it's funny that you bring that up because a friend of mine was like, "Hey, I can't go in there, but." He's like, I got a spot you should go check out.
And if someone talks to you, you never heard of me, man.
Exactly.
Oh.
And I looked at it on the map and I was like, that looks like a spot where you go in and you're going to be within 100 yards of 10 other dudes on the same ridge. Because I'm looking at it on the
Like
map. The only place.
One of them secret spots.
Yeah. The only place to go is right here.
Yeah.
And he's like, that's where those guys killed those bulls.
Yeah.
Like, weird.
A moment ago, you heard the voice of today's special guest, Rick Wallen, former. That's the kind we like. Former Yellowstone National Park senior bison biologist who did the role for 17 years of monitoring. Can we say buffalo?
Yes.
You cool with that?
I'm
You
totally
don't
cool with
correct
that.
people in the park when they say that?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Who performed that role for 17 years. And this is where, oftentimes on this show, we like to explore what I tend to call wildlife politics.
Very cool.
Meaning where wildlife issues take on an almost political tonality, where wildlife issues become a partisan issue, or wildlife issues become something to fight about.
Or you get billboards about wildlife issues.
Yeah,
Yep.
wildlife politics. There's like wildlife management, and then wildlife management's very close cousin. That's not even the right analogy. It's like
Wildlife management is really driven by politics, and it's been that way for decades.
there you go.
And conservation, on the other hand, is a little less partisan because you see people very supportive of conservation of wildlife.
They like
from both
they like
sides.
the idea of it.
They like the idea of it. They may not like the methods to get there.
Yeah. I brought up a bunch about in observations over the years is there's not a politician in America who would not like to be favorably compared to Theodore Roosevelt.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And they are probably not aware of how controversial the actions that he took were, and that if someone took those actions today, they would call them a communist. And they would threaten them, and they would have to have security people outside of their home.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I
If
worried a
Theodore
lot.
Roosevelt did what he did then today.
Yep. Yeah, and then, during my time trying to stand up for wild bison in Yellowstone and allowing them to, move across public land, we talked about that often.
Mm-hmm.
Whether after particular public meetings could we be seen going to the bar for a beer?
Yeah.
Because we were a little nervous about, the heated discussions that go on in those debates about what you can and can't do to preserve wild bison on public land.
Speaking of heated discussions, you're going to have a real problem with Chili.
Cool.
Not only is he in trouble for this now, but I'm just curious. I want to set the tone.
Okay.
Chili. So when you hear that Chili and Seth,
thank you,
are and have current and former tag holders for the Gardner hunt.
Oh.
Do you look at them and think, you sons of bitches? Or do you think like, oh, that's cool?
You know, hunting has been a tool for wildlife management for 100 years.
Uh-huh.
And when we debated about, opening up, bison hunting on the north boundary, we thought that hunting was going to be a really good thing for, allowing the animals to go a little bit farther and wider than just the park boundary.
Yeah.
And that we'd get a great deal of support by the hunters to come out and, and argue with the landowners, argue with the state game agency to come up with creative ways to manage the hunt so that they could expand the population boundaries or the distribution of the animals.
Yep.
So that there could be hunting like what I heard you guys talk about 10 minutes ago on a larger landscape. And it seems like it's much more like competitive hunting to see who can be the first one to shoot, the first one that steps across the park boundary. And the hunting that I envisioned back in 2009 when we were very supportive of hunting wild bison never came about.
Understood.
So
we're gonna get into that. That's the story I want to get
great.
into. And I don't mean to cut you off. We got to hit on a couple of quick bits of listener feedback, but that's the story I'd like to mainly dive into with you. Is that that's
a story that needs to be told.
That grand bargain did not.
It never panned out.
As yet,
it would have been a great cliffhanger.
Not Chili's fault.
Right there.
Yep.
It's not Chili's fault.
A little heavier editing on Phil's part. Like a murder podcast.
We had the kids on we had a bunch of kids on the show recently, and we did a podcast called "Our Girls Are Here to Kick Your Ass." And my daughter, Yanni's daughters, Pottery Pat's daughter. Who else we have? That was it for daughters.
Yeah, that's it.
And we were laughing about my daughter one time. We were walking through the woods squirrel hunting. And I hear her behind me go, because she had eaten a piece of deer shit thinking it was some kind of chocolate. And this guy wrote in, he had a hell of a time with his kid. He said he had a kid from 12 months to 3 who wouldn't stop picking up shit to eat.
Elk poop.
Like they became like a specialist.
I had a dog like that.
But he said that nothing bad ever happened to the kid.
It said he specifically selected for elk.
Nothing bad ever happened. So there you have it. Oh, I keep saying he. Anna Anderson. Oh, I guess
Yep.
she wrote her name down.
Yep. But the kid was a
The kid was a he.
yeah.
The person that wrote in was his mother.
Yeah.
And he this kid liked liver, big baby, real healthy, no nutritional deficiencies, weaned on wild game, liked liver, and had a taste for elk shit. We should offer that guy a job.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Especially after the problems we had with Max earlier today down here.
Yeah.
I wonder if he wants Max's job.
Brutal. Nobody can do anything right around here today.
Steve is just whipping.
This is here's a really surprise. This is like I kind of don't understand how this.
It's shocking.
Maybe Cal knows more about sort of like the evolution of this, but I know Cal's reported on it that Australia is South Australia is just flat out banning archery hunting. Private, public, whatever, like banning archery hunting. And someone's asking, the question is not so much like, what do you do about something like this? And I have like how the wheels of law turn in Australia. I have zero idea. But he was saying, I had made a comment one time when we were talking about the Proposition 127 in Colorado. And we were talking to some houndsmen who would have been affected. Proposition 127, to remind folks for the 8,000th time, was a push from a push to ban bobcat and lion hunting in Colorado. It was that proposition was defeated. After it was defeated, we had interviewed houndsmen, and we had asked, like, what would you really have done if it after your whole life spent with this discipline, what would you have really done if it became illegal? And he said how he commented, half joking that a law like that is a good way to make an honest man dishonest. And this person's bringing up, like, if something like this happens, what is your take on how would you react to it? Sort of meaning, would you just bow hunt anyway? Currently, prior to this ban, here's how fine-tuned it was. Bow hunting was allowed on private property for non-native species, of which they have a great quantity in Australia. Non-native species, rabbits, hares, foxes, goats, deer.
Red deer.
However, this upcoming ban, bow hunting will be illegal. It seems so, I remember a move. Remember we had that guy, who's that kind of, he's kind of a controversial figure in if you can be controversial in the broadhead world, he is Dr. Ed.
Dr. Ed Ashby.
Do you remember when there was a country in Africa that did not allow bow hunting? And he was doing a bunch of efficacy.
The area I think he was in was KwaZulu-Natal, if that makes sense.
And they were doing these efficacy programs to bring in bow hunting.
Right.
This is the first example I've heard of. I'm familiar with people bringing in archery seasons. This is the first example I've heard of eliminating bow hunting. Because it's especially funny because so many people would be like, well, that's ethical.
Eliminating bow hunting for non-native species on private land. Like, it was already a very narrow opportunity.
Yeah. And that's right. So, like, the context does matter. I mean, my perspective on this is it's just clearly another step in eliminating hunting altogether. But, it's like, you're like, oh, really? The animal welfare people who always advocate for the elimination of hunting are all of a sudden concerned about ethical hunting.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. It's like that's not really what they're concerned about. But their argument is like, well, is hunting a wildlife management tool? If so, let's treat it as an effective, efficient wildlife management tool. And you're in a country where you can hire, people who professionally eradicate game at night, using all sorts of manners and means, but, rifles with suppressors and taking only headshots. And it's like, well, if you want to eliminate the game or manage the game, do it in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah.
And or the most humane way possible, which is, I think we've discussed that a gajillion times, just an asinine word to use on things like this, in my opinion. So
that's the argument, is there's the argument coming from the people that want to see it gone and be like, we agree that there's some control that needs to occur with non-natives, but we'd like to eliminate any sort of like sporting flavor and do it in a more systematic, procedural fashion with trained professionals.
Yeah. And so, like, in this guy's example, he's like, I have small acreage property that I have permission to hunt, but firing a high caliber rifle would be displeasing to the neighbors, right? And it'd be like, well, use a smaller caliber rifle with subsonic ammunition and shoot them in the ear.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Problem solved. Why do you need bow hunting? And the argument would go on and on, right?
Yeah.
So hunting is also a cultural activity that people have an opportunity to engage in a manner that would be similar to our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of both a management tool for game agencies to manage abundance and distribution, but from society's perspective, it's a way to engage in a cultural activity that maybe your family were descendants of the long hunters or, someone like that.
Yep.
So that, it's a pride kind of a thing.
I think that perspective, I've never even been to Australia, but we get a lot of emails from Australia, and that perspective about hunting seems to be absent from discussions in Australia.
That's what I'm hearing.
It's like you see a lot of things about in Australia it's like issues of, a lot of the conversations are like issues of controlling non-natives, and even like controversial things like if kangaroos are shot. You see, there's, I hesitate to use this example because there's examples like this in the U.S., but an example like if you're shooting kangaroos for depredation, you can't utilize any resource from the kangaroo. But we have versions of that, meaning if you kill a bear for getting in your garage out of season, you don't. That's not your bear. Like you don't send it off to the taxidermist. It becomes the property of the state.
That's right.
So we have versions of that, but that sentiment seems to be more widespread and more kind of leading the discussion in Australia than perhaps here. And there's doesn't seem to be a lot of the hunters we hear from express a lack of any kind of acknowledgement of the culture of hunting and with wildlife managers and feral managers in Australia.
But so that we should answer the question, like what, because it's kind of an advocacy question, right? It's like, how do you stick up for yourself if you want to maintain bow hunting in the state or region that they're in? One super interesting case is the waterfowl, like maintaining a waterfowl season was recently under attack in Australia. And there weren't, just on paper, there were not enough waterfowl hunters to really effectively advocate for themselves, right? It's like what we talk about here in America is like, well, we need to maintain healthy hunter populations if we're going to maintain hunting, because if we dip below a certain set of percentage points, like it's just not going to be valuable enough to listen to hunters in a political sense. And in Australia, they were in a very real sense going to lose their ability to waterfowl hunt, and they were able to. And again, hunters, firearm owners were not a large enough political group on their own to effectively advocate for themselves, but they were able to get support from the labor unions and trade unions. Because a large percentage of the labor and trade folks were younger, disposable income, like to go out and do stuff outside.
Oh, so they found representation from
a
broader
big
group,
enough political group where people were like, oh, wait, all the electricians and plumbers and those guys?
Yeah. Be like, there aren't many, but a lot of them are here.
Yeah.
There aren't many, but I'm friends with a lot of them.
Yeah.
I remember that was one of the first times I had really seen it, or not that, in the state of Washington was one of the first times I've seen the lack of participation get weaponized. And it was around some trapping bans, and they were just making a lot of noise about, well, look how few people do it. You know, and I'd never seen someone like actually use that as the argument to not be able to do it. Meaning no one's really doing it, so why should you be allowed to do it?
Yeah.
If it was that important, people would be doing it. And it'd be like, so you'd be more comfortable with it if there's a lot of people doing it.
Yeah.
Here's a story out of Mississippi, and this one's interesting because you see this so many times in different ways. I remember they did it has to do with mislabeling fish in restaurants. And I remember some years ago, quite a few years ago, this piece came out that they went and sampled red snapper. Some organization sampled red snapper, and it was, I'm not exaggerating, I think it was 78% of red snapper wasn't red snapper because it's mangrove snapper. It's, I don't know, name a bunch of snappers.
Kubera, that's a cool one.
Sure. Like a bunch of snappers,
non-red snappers.
You can't tell them apart. I mean, like I'm saying, if I made you like fried up some snapper, and I had a blue line, a mangrove, a mutton, right on down the line, and a red snapper, and I said like, okay, sort them all out by taste. That's a tough task to do. So I think that all these different snappers in the marketplace, at some point, someone was just being like, "Yeah, it's red snapper. It's all red snapper." Here's an egregious example of mislabeling, and this ain't even close. Mary Mahoney's old French house in Biloxi, Mississippi. Been in business since 1962, and a building that dates to 1737 was passing off tilapia as grouper.
Oh, come on.
Oh,
That's like
geez.
deer shit as deer meat. I've eaten a lot of tilapia. Not a lot. I've eaten enough to know it ain't grouper.
That's a good. Yeah.
5 years of probation in order to pay $1.5 million in fines.
They got whopped, so that's deserving.
Jeez.
So what they came after, they had a criminal fine of what makes sense. So you go like, well, how do you arrive at that number? A criminal fine of a criminal fine of $150,000. But what they came after him about is like, I guess like a cost discrepancy thing. A forfeiture. That's a hard word to say. Did I nail it? Forfeiture of $1.3 million for fraudulent sales. So not even fine, but basically saying you have been bilking people out of, buying this for like 70 cents a pound or whatever the hell tilapia goes for when buying groupers probably, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so I wonder if on the menu, it said like market price. You know how those seafood restaurants do that?
I'm really curious how this got started, if it was a disgruntled employee or a patron with a really refined palate. It's just like...
I don't want to get anybody in trouble. One time we were in a very remote Alaska town that is not on the road system.
Mm-hmm.
And we were stuck at an airstrip, and there's like a little place you could stay and eat there. And like a lot of nights they don't have any customers. And I remember he had it was chicken Alfredo. He's like, I'm gonna have chicken Alfredo. And we all sat down there to eat. I'm like, that ain't chicken. Like I've eaten enough spruce grouse and no spruce grouse when I see one. But I appreciated that.
Chickens did they have?
Well, I mean, we just right before flying out of Wichita, Kansas, 2 days ago. Peter Kung and I were at a Mexican restaurant, and they had skirt steak on the menu. And I was like, skirt steak? Awesome. And the guy's like, how do you want that cooked? And I was like, well, there's only one way to cook a diaphragm. And he's like, medium rare is how most people get it. And I was like, well, I'm like, what cut is it? And he's like, well, it comes back here off the end of the... I'm like, oh, that's a flank steak. I'm like, okay, sounds good. So,
a little more color on this. They did it for 6 years. They sold 58,750 pounds of tilapia imported from Africa, India, and South America at what they're calling premium prices.
Jeez.
There's another article I was going to get into, but I'm not going to get into it. But the long and short of it is, it's out of India, northern India. So from far away. Not Indiana, for you people that just heard Indiana. India, wildlife, this is a thorny one, and you can picture this pissing people off in America. Wildlife researchers in India who are looking at relations with like Asian elephants, Asiatic tigers. Is there any other kind of tiger? Tigers. Have trail cams out, and part of the purpose of the trail cams is to see how women do a lot of gathering in this community in India. Women spend a lot of time gathering natural resources in the wild. So the camera program is meant to monitor not just predator-prey relations, but to monitor how area women use resources. And the women are very intimidated and don't like it, and have changed a lot of their habits. Like they traditionally sing while they're gathering resources because there's a risk of predation from tigers. They traditionally sing, but women reporting that they don't feel comfortable doing that now because they have to be out doing their resource extraction on camera. And it's changed their desire.
I don't like singing on camera either.
It's changed their desire to be out. It's impacted how long they like to be in the woods, what they do in the woods. And they're reporting that like the surveillance, and they're like, well, it's important for us to understand how people utilize the resources. Picture in the U.S. if they said we're curious what hunters are doing, so we're gonna go and put out tons of trail cameras to watch how hunters are going about their business.
Well, I mean, that's already changed a lot of. I'm always looking for cameras. There's so many stinking cameras around these days.
Yeah, I sneak around. I always catch them and I like go around back. You know,
I probably peed in front of trail
Oh,
cameras.
yeah.
I did that a couple
yeah.
weeks ago.
You know?
Taking a leak,
that's
looked
part of this
up, and
article.
Yeah.
A
Trail
woman-
cameras
Like,
pointed right at me.
everyone's,
you know,
yeah.
that's part of this article.
surveillance
and they
state.
put it up online. They caught one of these women peeing in the woods, and it wound up on WhatsApp. And,
Oh no, yeah.
and humiliated her.
Yeah, when we were hunting Phelps and I and Rick Smith and Max, when we were filming in Washington last year, we all stopped and you know how one guy starts peeing and everyone, it's a good time to pee too, and look around and yeah, trail camera right there, got all of us. I don't think that's wound up
That,
online.
yeah,
We
that
were
could
on
be
a-
the next calendar.
We were on a meteor shoot one time. I think it was Florida. And I get a message on Instagram. I see you guys are hunting
Yep.
the area.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah. He because he had a cellular camera.
And he's
And
like, look, it's Steve and Seth,
recognized us.
and put
Yeah.
it on.
He just messaged. I don't think he put it online. Well, maybe he did, but
If I could just add like a blanket regulation, there would any sort of remote, roadless, wilderness designation, all of that come hunting season would just get like a blanket dropped over the top of it with 0 cell phone reception for hunting season.
Yeah, I saw they're trying to take a bunch of federal money recently. You'll appreciate this, our guest here, to increase cell phone service in national parks. Whatever. What do you think about that, Rick?
That means we're getting a different kind of visitor to national parks, and
The kind that
Well,
wants to build chat.
exactly the kind that doesn't really want to go there for the resources. They want to be able to take pictures and send them to someone to say, "Look where I'm at. I'm at this location, and I found this animal." Things of that nature.
Got it.
They've been doing foolish things like that for a decade or more, trying to get as close as they could to the elk with the large antler and do the selfie, and then they get butted in the rear from the antler, kind of a thing. So.
What drew you to working at the park? Like, what was your professional path to land at Yellowstone National Park?
Oh, that's a very good question. I should have thought about that and knew you might ask that. But I think it was more just fate than anything else. I grew up in Colorado. I moved to Jackson Hole in the early 1980s to be a trail hand on the trail crew because I loved to be out in the wilderness. And I started to see that my undergraduate degree in biology wasn't quite enough, and I needed to find a way to go to graduate school. And I picked U of M and Montana State to look for graduate school projects. And I landed here at MSU studying harlequin ducks.
Oh, really?
And I did. I did.
good.
It was a beautiful project. My professor wanted me to study rabbits at the National Engineering Lab in Idaho. And I said, no, I'm going to do my own project. I'm going to make this as hard as possible. And I'm going to do something cool in the wilderness. And he helped me raise money. And I just fell in love with the national parks by, as a trail hand. And then decided that ecology was sort of my calling because I loved nature. And I went to graduate school in fish and wildlife management here. My first job was back at Grand Teton as a biologist at Grand Teton. And I did a big circle around the national parks and ended up back in Yellowstone. And I think it was fate as well. I came to do a backpack trip from the south end of Yellowstone Lake to the Buffalo Valley on Togety Pass, big wilderness, the most remote places in the country. And I stumbled into a friend of mine that told me, pretty soon we're going to be hiring a biologist to do bison work around here. You should apply. And so I kept in touch and applied, and by golly, I got the job. So I knew what I was getting into because bison.
Like you knew it'd be hot.
I knew it'd be hot because as a graduate student here in the mid '80s, there was animals starting to leave the park. They were being harvested by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, auctioned off at the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks regional office around here. It was big business, big news all over the place. And so I followed it in newspapers most of my career, and I thought, I want to be somewhere where biology's interesting. And boy, did I fall into an interesting spot at Yellowstone trying to conserve wild bison.
Yeah.
So,
can you give a real high? Can you give a real high level snapshot, being as fair as possible to all interested parties, of sort of the landscape around the wild bison conversations that are happening in the West and how the park fits into that?
So I've heard stories from everybody, and I think even on this podcast in the past, once upon a time, there were 30 million wild bison, across, America. And there was a military strategy to conquer the West. And the military strategy was to eliminate bison. And that would be our way to battle all of the various native cultures that lived all over the West. And it was successful. And the 30 million wild bison that was 300 years ago became a couple dozen animals at Yellowstone and maybe 100 or 200 up in the far north of Canada before, someone decided to try and turn it all around.
Mm-hmm.
And at Yellowstone, it was the Army, because the Army ran Yellowstone at the turn of the last century. So the Army hired a bison tender, and he just happened to be one of the 5 ranchers around the West that went out and gathered a few calves. And
was that Buffalo Jones?
Buffalo Jones, yep.
Out of Texas.
And so Buffalo Jones came to Yellowstone and started restoring the population, and they got a small group of animals from Texas. I think it was 3 bulls from Colonel Goodnight. And then he had some connections up in the Flathead Valley, got 18 females from the Flathead Valley. And they're from the population that's now the National Bison Range in that area of the state. And there was 21 animals brought to Mammoth, sort of a display herd. They reproduced well. There was the couple of dozen animals in the interior of Yellowstone, and this whole restoration project, got on the board by Congress saying, we got to save wild bison. We can't just let them, go extinct. And conservation of bison was part of the enabling legislation of Yellowstone, conservation of most of the wildlife as well, because it was all being hunted out. And I don't think anyone ever dreamed that they would recover to the level that they have.
Okay.
And in the 1940s, Yellowstone had an abundance of bison. Well, at that point in time, an abundance of bison was 1,000 of them. So they were seeing that in order to make this conservation of this animal on a broader scale, they started giving away bison to farmers and ranchers and preserves all over the place. And the conservation of wild bison kind of went down a different path than elk and deer and sheep, because as we took animals from Yellowstone, like we took deer and sheep and pronghorn from Yellowstone, spread them all over the country, but we didn't put them in fences.
Yeah, they all got moved as wild animals.
As wild animals, free roaming for as far, and let the animals make the decision on, where they want to migrate to, who lives because they make good decisions, all of that kind of stuff. But for some reason, the country decided that in order to save wild bison, they all had to be within fences. So I think the bottom line is humans forgot how to live with wild bison and forgot how to respect the nature of wild bison on the landscape. And it was easy to just put them in fences. So for 100 years now, we've been saving wild bison from the Great Plains, even as far east as the East Coast. There's preserves in Pennsylvania and Virginia and places like that.
But let's narrow in on that question for a second, because this is something I don't know the answer to. This is something that baffles me, and I think it'd be a great project for a serious historian.
Mm-hmm.
Like I get it in a broad sense, but I'll lay out the question. Be like, we recovered grizzly bears as a wild animal.
Yep.
We recovered bighorn sheep as a wild animal.
Yep.
We recovered elk as a wild animal. I'll point out there were no elk in New Mexico.
That's right.
Right. There was a time when there was 0 elk in New Mexico.
Yep.
Right. We recover elk as a wild animal. wolves get recovered as a wild animal. I would love like to really know the discussions and decisions were made. How did they arrive at like everything? This like great Noah's Ark of creatures will all be politically wild except you.
I don't have an answer for that either.
But Randall.
I mean, I think like I couldn't find this in a document, but I think the answer that most people would arrive at is that the ecological niche of the buffalo was filled in by cattle, right? I mean, at the same time that the plains are being emptied of buffalo, cattle are coming in. And I can't really think, like, obviously domestic sheep and wild sheep share the same niche. I guess I wonder if it's a question of the power of the lobby, but like that would be my guess is the ranching industry would have not particularly appreciated releasing giant bovine grazers.
Competitors.
Yeah.
I think it.
But you're. I
that's
think
just a gut.
Yeah,
but
I think that's a huge part of it. But even if you look at like isolated intermountain valleys that aren't even great cattle country, and at the time probably my guess is there was not a big cattle presence, for instance, in the upper Yellowstone Valley. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Early 1900s, was there a big cattle presence in the upper Yellowstone?
I think there
Right here
was.
in the Gallatin.
okay.
Yeah, I mean,
In the Paradise Valley, definitely.
Nelson Story brought cattle
Yes.
in there like in the 1870s.
Yeah, I was going to point out, and you already shot down part of it. I was going to point out that like that even in areas where that conflict wouldn't have been as acute, but you're right. If people were running cattle at the time when we had them all bottled up, I've even mentioned before that like there was a moment when we knew where they all were, right?
That's
like,
right.
Somewhere between like 1882 and 19 whatever, there was a moment when someone could say like, I know where they're all at.
Yep.
I know where everyone is. And in that instant, we became really comfortable with them as something that we know where they're all at.
That's exactly right.
And since then, we don't have any that we don't know where they're at.
And I think, I mean, I
Well, look
didn't,
at Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee. All of them have elk hunts, right? RMEF has put elk out there. And all of those states have a geographical area where if those elk step out of that geographical area, it's an over-the-counter thing for landowners.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, because there was an agreement made based on agriculture that this is where the elk are going to be, and we're all okay with that.
Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I mean, I do agree with you that I have not seen like a history of the debates, like the actual, like I would love to read letters and debates within agencies about how it was that bison became not wild or unwilded, recovered, but not.
I know there's some congressional record that would be valuable to get a hold of in the late 1800s, because that was part of George Catlin's perspective that we needed to save, some great national park where we could save, all these wildlife species that were being hunted for subsistence at that point in time. But
continue. You go ahead and continue your story. I just wanted to ask a little about that because that's the thing. Like of all the interesting parts of what you're telling us, like that decision that we as a culture, as a society made.
Yes,
it's never been adequately explained to me,
and I don't think it ever could be. And I think competition for grass is probably a key component of it, and that there's been probably a unrealistic perspective that you could restore 30 million again and still have the same level of human occupancy on the landscape. But there's no reason that you couldn't at least restore a couple of populations, like Cal pointed out. We've done it with elk in a few places where they disappeared many years ago. And in fact, there was a hunting club in Utah in early 1940s that got a group bison from Yellowstone and took them to the Henry Mountains of Utah, turned them loose, and they wanted to have a wild population. And I'm sure they felt like, well, this is a remote location. They'll probably just stay here. And I think the first thing they did is, move 50 or 60 miles.
Is that right?
So they have a new location. But Utah's figured out how to do it, and it's not been easy. There's been a lot of conflict with the local ranchers, but they've learned how to do it, and they have a very sporting bison elk hunt for managing abundance and distribution. And bison really are sort of an indicator of where the most productive habitats are in that area that they occupy.
You mean they'll find it?
They'll find it, yeah. They'll definitely find it. So I think that you could do that in a few other places, but you'll never be able to have, because of the ecology of wild bison, they do compete with habitat, with cattle, with humans, with agriculture. And in order to do our national mammal right, it would be valuable to do just like what you described, designate an area that's legitimate for wild bison to distribute around the greater Yellowstone area and allow the culture of, tribal hunting and, subsistence hunting by the rest of us, that like to go out and do something that our ancestors did. But I really think that the states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming felt like they had their eye on the Yellowstone restoration of wild bison from the very beginning and have always assumed that they would just be kept within the national park, just like we've done at all other national parks where wild bison are. But all those other national parks have fences. So Wind Cave, Badlands, all those places have fences for keeping their bison. Teddy Roosevelt has fences around it. So at Yellowstone,
those parks have taken the responsibility of fencing those creatures in.
Well, that depends on whose responsibility is. I don't know whether those are fence out or fence in states.
Yeah, got it.
In Montana, it's a fence out, and if you don't want the wildlife or you don't want your neighbor's cattle on your property, you're supposed to fence your own property to keep that kind of stuff off of it. So Yellowstone's one of the few national parks that's large enough in the lower 48 states that can allow ecology to play its role on the landscape. And we don't prohibit bighorn sheep from staying in the national park, and we don't prohibit elk or deer or pronghorn or any of the other, native species from leaving the national park. But we do have, laws in Montana that say as soon as they leave the national park, it's the agriculture department that manages wild bison on Montana lands. So that was done primarily because of a cattle disease that was brought to the area, a bacteria that, affects the reproductive tract of large mammals, brucellosis. And that's kind of been the arguing point as to why bison can't be restored as wildlife like the other animals. And I think that it was, it was somewhat legitimate because...
You think it was?
Initially, the farmers and ranchers, they want to make a profit. And so if you're in business for yourself and you want to make a profit, you don't want things to come to your ranch that would cause mortality, to your profit-making machine.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, it causes heifers to abort
pregnancies.
They'll abort their first. They'll abort their first calf.
Right. By and large, that's what it is. It's a little more complicated than that,
okay.
But it's not every one of them. But then there's a few that just never recover from the disease.
I see.
But by and large, animal gets infected, gets pregnant, aborts pregnancy, gets immune to the disease. Any other future pregnancy, they're gonna have their calf. It's going to be fine. But a farmer's going to, that's money in the bank for him if he loses.
A couple years ago, I did a ride along with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And it was during the most successful bison harvest
was that, 2
hunting
years
season
ago?
2 years ago.
I
yeah.
did mine the year before. There was
And there was nothing,
You
right?
lucked out,
Yeah.
Cal.
Yep.
So, if you go by the numbers, it was like an unbelievable amount of bison taken out, buffalo killed, comparatively, but it was still an buffalo remained over objective for like that carrying capacity number that was agreed to.
Yeah, the social carrying capacity
Yeah.
was a court negotiated number in a court case between 1995 and 2000.
And then there's like a starting line
Yes.
and a finish line
Yes.
on that Gardner zone.
Yep.
And at the finish line, so the starting line would be the park boundary.
Yep.
You paying attention, Chili?
Oh yeah.
And the finish line is the end of the negotiated outside of the park bison range.
Right. Right.
And-
the state calls it a tolerance zone.
The tolerance
Most people
zone,
call
yeah.
it a conservation area. So
And at the finish line was, and this is something I had never heard or seen before, but at the finish line was the state brand inspector.
What?
Yeah, and his job is to be the guy on the finish line and make sure no bison cross the tolerance zone. Yeah, which I was just like,
Was he having any action?
I think he's a pretty hands-on participant down there as far as like, he's rounding up people and
Yeah.
making sure that they know where the buffalo are.
But
so
was
they can
he
fill their
getting? Was
tags.
he getting? That year, was he getting stuff that was making it through the zone?
I didn't get to talk with him.
I believe a few animals went beyond that line in the sand, if you will.
Yeah.
But not many. There's
Line
so
in the
many
snow.
hunters now. And I would say that the state offers like 44 permits or something like that. I haven't checked lately. But
Yeah. I think
The-
they handed out 40.
40, okay, somewhere in that neighborhood.
But the tribal
tribes-
number is much larger.
Yeah, the tribal numbers are much larger. There's no limit really. Each tribe issues a tag to anyone that wants one, and some tribes issue 4 or 5 tags to various families if they want to gather multiple bison.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they
and-
can still provide meat for everybody.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah, for the whole
Like
family,
a
their whole
traditional
neighborhood,
harvest
that kind
type
of thing.
method. Yeah.
Let's
Yeah,
hit on this
so-
brucellosis thing for a little bit, because there's a lot of questions about this that I have, that I've heard others voice. Guys like me who are buffalo advocates and who would like to see a much bigger tolerance zone. Okay. A bigger tolerance zone and more of them. Okay.
A lot of people would like to see that.
Now, I will say to people, don't give me the whole brucellosis thing, because elk have brucellosis.
You nailed it.
So, okay. Did I nail it? Is there
Yep.
something I'm not seeing? Can you speak to this for a minute?
I can speak to that. And
Okay.
it's a really
What
good
is the
question.
difference?
So in 1995, when the governor of Montana sued the federal agencies to not let any bison leave the national park because some were infected with brucellosis, the assumptions were, because we didn't have good science on it all, the assumptions were that bison were the primary vector for infecting the system, and that elk were infected because buffalo were infecting the elk. And
Okay.
if we could eliminate brucellosis from the buffalo population that lived in Yellowstone, brucellosis would just disappear in the elk.
They
because
were the super
couldn't-
spreaders.
The super spreaders, exactly. That's a good term for it.
Yeah. They were the Gavin Newsoms of.
Sure. Anyway, that was the assumption of the time.
Yeah.
And it was a bad assumption, to begin with. And the Park Service argued with the U.S. Department of Agriculture about that assumption.
Okay.
Because in Jackson Hole,
Can you give the background on that assumption? Like, how was that arrived at?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can only suspect. And I suspect that it had to do with, like a capitalistic perspective that, buffalo compete with our cattle and we got to get rid of buffalo. So we got to find some sort of legal way to show that, we have backing to get rid of it. And an analogy is that the people that really argue to preserve wilderness use the Wilderness Act, things like that. They use the Endangered Species Act, as a sort of a political tool to try and win, in court kind of a thing. And, brucellosis came to North America when we brought cattle from Europe and Africa and places like that. So it's ironic that we colonized the Great Plains with cattle, and we brought this disease with some of those cattle, and that disease is something that is a problem for profit. And the USDA started in the 1930s to eliminate brucellosis, because back then there were a lot of people that milked their cows and they had brucellosis, and they would create infection in humans. So because it was a vector to humans, undulate fever. And so it creates sort of a, by late in the day, you feel lethargic and you have a fever. It creates, I think, other infection within the lymph system of the human being to basically drain energy from you. So you recover at nighttime, you get up in the morning, you feel good, but by, sometime during the day, you're starting to feel tired again. And
sounds very familiar.
I see Randall. I was thinking the same thing. I was like, I got that problem.
There was a lot of humans across the country.
I got that problem bad.
Yeah. And the infection actually caused problems to the military all the way back when there was Mediterranean wars, and it was called Malta fever originally when it was first discovered. Because an army over in the little tiny, island of Malta, all the soldiers were getting, infected because they'd been drinking milk from, the cows and stuff around
Couldn't
there.
fight in the afternoons.
You can't fight, period, if you're
We're
tired
hit them
all
hard
the
in
time.
the morning.
Yeah, that's right. So brucellosis is a worldwide issue, especially in developed countries, but pasteurization made it a bit of a non-issue.
Okay.
And that as we pasteurized milk over time, we eliminated the bacteria from milk products. And the USDA was very strategic and going around the country from 1930 to they started getting states brucellosis free in the 1960s and 70s. But what they would do is go to the farm, test the farm animals. If an animal had brucellosis, they'd make the farmer get rid of all their cows and they'd pay them, some price.
And that's how they tackled it.
That's how they tackled it, yeah. And so...
And can you talk about transmission from one animal to the next?
Yeah, the bacteria manifests itself in pretty concentrated forms in the amniotic fluid of the reproductive tract. So whenever there's a stillbirth or even a natural birth, an animal infected has a full-term calf, the calf is born, the amniotic sac is spilled out, all that fluid becomes a transmission vector. And
they got a desire to lick it for some reason.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Almost all of the, the mammals of that nature that are herding, grouping type animals, they're in groups. So when they see that first calf born, they all want to go see it and, see what's going on. And as the first 10 or 15% of them are born, they're super curious. And then, the fascination wanes. And by your time you're halfway through the breeding or calving season, they're not as interested in that because it's not new anymore.
Yep.
So,
but they do. They eat that afterbirth.
Yep, and that's
AB we like to call it.
Yep, absolutely. That's a survival mechanism for deer and elk and pronghorn because it cleans up the site. And predators don't smell the offspring, the newborn fawns and calves. They don't have any odor for a short while. So, mom cleans up the birth site, stashes the calf. There's no smell, and the predators, have to more visually identify their prey than to do it through smell. So,
and there's no reason just to go back into this point again. There's no reason that there's no thing about transmission to a cow, like cattle cow. There's no reason that it getting the amniotic fluid or getting the bacteria from a bison's afterbirth is sort of like more concentrated or more likely to transmit to a cow than if a cow were to interact with the elk's afterbirth.
The biology is all the same.
Okay.
All the same. And so
if an elk was infected and a cow licked that afterbirth, it's just as likely to transmit. It's just as likely to pick up that bacteria as if it came off a bison.
yeah, absolutely.
It's not like a super bacteria in a bison.
And there's some small concentrated areas of the Paradise Valley where the elk down there test positive at like almost 50%. Right? And then other places in the system, it's lower than that. And then the argument in the 1990s after, the state of Montana became brucellosis free was that we can't afford to let our cattle ranchers have, any new brucellosis infection because of that, that policy I told you about. If they get caught and one of their cows has brucellosis, the policy was, well, the USDA comes in and makes you get rid of all your cows. And I don't think they give them the fair market value, at least not considering what the future value would have been in those animals as well.
Yeah.
So it's not as profitable for ranchers to just, live on the landscape and learn how to live with brucellosis in the system.
My understanding too on the brucellosis issue from a rancher's perspective is that when you have free status, there's some testing alleviation. But when you're when you're not operating in brucellosis free status, there's a testing requirement.
Yeah.
Like your region is designated as a brucellosis zone or a brucellosis free zone, depending on where you are. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the debate in Montana was that, a rancher in Gallatin County and Park County, probably had a much higher definitely has a much higher probability of that as a threat to his livestock than a rancher from Kalispell, because there isn't any brucellosis affected herds anywhere near Kalispell.
Got it.
So when USDA would come in and, find brucellosis in a cattle herd, they would shut down sales by the state, statewide.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's
I've heard this
why
before,
it was a problem,
some
economically for the state of Montana.
Yeah, some guy out in Webo, Montana is like, what?
Yeah, exactly. And so he would not
I haven't seen an elk or buffalo in years.
Exactly. Century maybe, right?
Yeah.
So the USDA realized that was an undue burden on the livestock industry. And in 2010, they kind of changed all of the rules. Most of the rest of the country had become brucellosis free. Industry was humming along brilliantly. And in 2010, USDA drew a line around basically the greater Yellowstone system. In fact, the line coincided exactly with where they thought brucellosis-infected elk occurred throughout the Yellowstone system. And said, all right, here's where the threat is. Let's just apply this policy only in this area where ranchers are likely to encounter that issue. And so it greatly relieved, ranchers away from Yellowstone in the 3 states surrounding this region. So it changed the game completely in 2010. And so the court case between the governor of Montana and the federal agencies in 1995 was that...
Was that Governor Roscoe?
It was Governor Roscoe, yes. And so the complaint against the feds was that, if the state were to lose their brucellosis-free status, it's going to affect a huge number of businessmen throughout the whole state. And so we can't let any bison leave the national park. Well, now that zone, of acceptance anyway for brucellosis, and then new conservation measures put in place, to protect the industry of farmers and ranchers within that zone, change the name or change that game to the point where, elk are still a threat to them and they won't lose their brucellosis status, but that farmer and rancher has to do that more intensive testing like you were talking about.
Okay.
And so they have to go in and test about every 5 or 6 months. And they have to have 3 tests in a row where none of the animals in their herd test positive.
Got it.
And then they clear that brucellosis affected herd.
So it's a very
status.
burdensome.
It's very burdensome for a rancher to have to go do that. I believe, at least at one point, and I think it's still the case, that USDA covers the cost of all that testing. And I'm pretty sure that ranchers round their cows up at least once a year to go through vaccinations and, weaning and what else, branding, all kinds of things. So at least one of those 3 roundups could be done at sort of the routine time of year, when they do that kind of stuff. But having to do it 3 times in a row, and if they miss a time, then it becomes 4 or 5 or 6 until they get to that 3 times in a row. So you can see that there is some economic impact to the cattle industry within this zone. So in 2017, the National Academy of Sciences came to the region and brought scientists that have been studying brucellosis all around the area and in their careers. And they looked at the issue, and the questions that they were facing was, is elk really a significant impact? And that assumption that I talked about earlier, that it would just go away if we got rid of brucellosis in bison, they disproved that. Mm-hmm. And the way they disproved that was to show that, the elk in areas like Idaho, where there's no bison interaction, and the Green River Valley of Wyoming, there's no buffalo interaction. There's a few places around where elk are infected with brucellosis, and they were infecting cattle of the area. And there was enough information on how elk move about the system. I heard you guys talking to Matt Kaufman not long ago. Yeah. And Matt did a lot of studies with his students at the University of Wyoming, with putting radio collars on and showing animal movements. And there are radio collar studies that show elk moving out of places like Jackson Hole into Idaho, into Montana, never even migrating through Yellowstone National Park or anywhere where there's buffalo involved. And cattle are getting infected with brucellosis. So it pretty much resolved the debate that elk are a maintenance reservoir of the disease. Yep. And you can't just assume that solving the problem with buffalo will solve it with elk. And there's no way we're going to go around and round up every elk in the greater Yellowstone system.
That'd be political suicide.
That would be absolutely. That is.
We just can't do an election, and no one involved in that election would have proposed that all the elk need to go away.
And that's the only way that you could do that, like they did it in the livestock industry. And they wouldn't have to do it once; they'd have to do it multiple times. So I think that the industry is starting to realize that, well, until there's some sort of technology for learning how to, inoculate livestock that is 100%, foolproof that their animals won't become infected if they're, encounter a brucellosis-affected birth site, then we're going to be living with brucellosis in the greater Yellowstone area. And so there's a great deal of debate among the staunch conservationists that, well, now, if elk are allowed to move around the system like that, why can't bison? Why do we have to have the conservation zone, the Gardner Basin and the West Yellowstone Valley? And why can't it be that same zone that brucellosis-infected elk have opportunity to roam around? And it'll take citizen debate, to try and change the state of Montana's perspective to do something like that. Because it won't just happen because Montana thinks that's the right thing to do.
Even though elk destroy a lot of fences.
They do. Yeah,
they can still go over them.
Absolutely.
Whereas the bison,
he's got one way.
Well, I'll argue with you on that one, Cal, because
right?
because I lived in the Gardner Basin for a long time, and I lived, 13 miles from the park boundary, and we periodically had 25, 30 animals roll through our property of, 4 or 5 acres, and if you don't chase them, they'll figure out where the gate is. And they'll walk to the gate, and if you go out and tell them you don't want them tearing up your new landscaping, they'll walk back over to the gate and leave. And so I think it's a matter of humans learning how to live with wild bison. And it's inconvenient.
Sure.
It's more inconvenient to live with wild bison than it is to live with wild pronghorn wild deer and things of that nature. And I think that bison as fence destroyers gets a bad name. You're right. You get to running them and all. They see the fence there, they don't even bother. They just blow right through it.
I was like very shocked that day that I went up, admittedly one day.
Uh-huh.
But there's this line of cows walking back towards the park.
Oh, uh-huh.
And, they'd lost a few members along the way.
Yeah.
But they were still just walking.
Yep.
And eventually the people who must have harassed them closer to the finish line than the start line came back up alongside of them, and that lead cow started trotting and just picked up steam, and she crossed the road, blew through a fence, went right through the ranch yard there, blew through the next fence, and did so in a way that you're like, nothing would have diverted those.
Change your mind.
Yeah, that's right.
Nothing.
That's exactly right.
I was amazed.
That was due to them learning the landscape, and they recognized the hunters. Their level of stress goes up because they lost 25% of their group, 10 miles behind them, and they knew where they were going. And if the hunters hadn't caught up with them and created that vision that they had just faced 2 hours ago, they'd have probably just kept walking.
Yeah.
And just walked, and they'd have gone to the gate. I'm positive they would have gone to the gate.
I was pretty blown away, though, because I was like, oh, that's a different way for animals to act.
Yeah.
Different way for bison to act.
So, that brings up a good question that you guys discussed earlier about sort of the ethics of hunting.
Well, I want to ask you a different question first.
Okay, go.
Can you walk me through that time period? I think of the mid 90s, but maybe it was earlier. That time period when the park hit a certain population of the animals.
Oh, okay.
Where they needed to expand range. Right?
Yeah.
Or do I understand this
No,
wrong?
you got that right.
Okay.
If you look back on over time, we brought all those animals I talked about. In the 1902 was the first year they came to Mammoth. 1907 they filled up their capacity of the pen around Mammoth, and they moved them out to the Lamar Valley, and they didn't put any fences up. They just let them roam. Well, they kind of stayed around there for a while, and the early park rangers and the old buffalo tenders used to get out on horseback, and they'd chase them up into the hills, hoping that they could introduce the introduced herd to the native herd, because the native herd summered on the high plateau south of Lamar Valley up along the east boundary, and the native herd would migrate to Pelican Valley down by Yellowstone Lake in the winter. And so at the early teens into maybe 1920 was sort of this, meeting of the two herds. And from there, the Park Service thought that they really needed to, ranch bison. It was the prevailing thought of how you restore wildlife populations. So they took plows to the Lamar Valley. If you go out, you can find old irrigation ditch lines. The Lamar Valley truly was a big ranch back in the 1920s.
But they were raising grass.
They were raising grass. Yeah. They were pushing it up with the beaver slides and stacking it all up. And then they would bring it into, the area that the bison could get to it. And they were helping the bison. They might have even still been killing wolves and stuff, in the early part of that century. Well, that was great for long-term survival. And then the brucellosis issue came along. There was a bunch of up and down of population abundance because we tried to eliminate brucellosis. But in 1966, the park said, we're not going to do any of this ranching business anymore. We're going to follow this sort of let ecological processes play out. People call it natural regulation. People call it all kinds of things. But ecology became sort of the leading edge of policy for the National Park Service. And the bison knew what to do. That it was all about survival of the fittest. They knew where to go to find those old hay fields. And there are records that in the 1940s, there were some big winters, like maybe a couple years ago. And some pretty good size groups went to Gardner Basin a group of 40-some animals in 1943 migrated almost to immigrant.
No kidding.
No kidding.
And they let them.
Well, I think there was some sympathy because of how difficult the winter was.
Got it.
And
I had no idea they were leaving the park at that
Yep.
that long ago.
Yep. And
Okay.
so about that time is when you started seeing in the historic record observations of at least the sort of older males leaving the winter range up in the Lamar Valley. And around Gardner, you could find a few nearly every year at that point.
What's the farthest you know of a park buffalo ever making it out of the park?
Let's see. I'm guessing that's about it. The winter of 96, 97 was another really big winter. If anyone was around here then.
Oh, that's
was
when
a killer
when
winter.
the issue just blew up.
It totally blew up.
Because it
at
was
that
Department
point.
of Livestock guys on snow
Yep.
machines just dumping hundreds of
Yep.
them.
And that's when the Buffalo Field campaign.
That's right.
Yeah.
They
Really?
started up
Yeah.
about that time. And animals were in little nooks and crannies, again, as far south or east. No, north. No, it's north,
yeah.
isn't it, as an immigrant. In
Just
some of
for
the farms around
People to
immigrant
know
area. So.
how many miles north. I used to live
So-
in Immigrant, so I should know this.
So
40,
immigrant
let's
to
say.
the Lamar Valley
just
is
so that the audience can get a sense
80
of that.
miles
Oh, okay.
probably.
Okay.
So, and bison migrate differently. It's sort of a combination of nomadism and migration because
Okay.
when you see them in the fall, they're a little bit more nomadic early in the fall because they reach out and walk to where they think they might go 3 or 4 months from now.
Oh,
And then they walk back.
like a scouting mission.
Exactly. And so bison will leave like the Hayden Valley and they'll go over the top of the Mary Mountain and down into the Old Faithful area. And they might mill around Old Faithful for 3 or 4 months. And then the next time they want to move, they'll move down to Madison Junction. And there they have 2 avenues. They either go west or go north, from that. And some of those migrations are a little over 100 miles. So animals that you could find near the mud pots of Hayden Valley could end up in the Gardner Hunt, just outside the park, and that's a little over 100 miles if you follow the route that they take.
Yeah.
And we've seen animals move from the Hayden Valley out west. They end up out at West Yellowstone. They would get harassed, and pushed back to the park. And they knew they needed to go somewhere because they're looking for that green up and the low elevate that Matt talked about, several podcasts
What's
ago.
his term? The
green
surfing
up.
the green
Surfing
wave.
the green wave. Yeah, they're going down to surf. And when they can't get to it going west at West Yellowstone, all of that pressure to push them back into the park, I think, generated more exploratory behavior, and they pushed north. And Gardner Basin's like the first place to green up, unless you're at one of the hot springs all around. But it's that low elevation area. It has the least amount of snowpack. It's got the earliest amount of or earliest temperature of 32 degrees and warmer. You get the green up, and once they find the green up, they'll just camp on it and follow the green up back through the elevational gradient until they get to some of the bigger grasslands in the park. And then they'll kind of let the green up go on higher, and they'll camp and make lawns.
Is it snowpack that pushes those bison?
Yes, it's a combination of abundance and snowpack. And in the 1990s and the early 2000s, there was a thought that it was abundance of about 2,000 animals that would really, create that social competition for bites of grass underneath the snow, and that some would leave and some would keep working the snowpack.
Gotcha.
And I think because of all of the pressure in the last 20 or 30 years of pushing them back into the park, what we've really done is we've made them search farther and wider, and now there's more that are the, diggers that dig the big pits to find the grass under the snow. And there's an ecology behind that in that the larger animals move those big heads and make little craters for feeding in. And the younger animals with the smaller heads wait till they abandon the craters and they go over and they eat the residual. So groups of animals have learned how to, carry young animals through the winter by digging all those feeding craters and tromping down all those ski trails or, trails for walking around like we make ski trails. They make buffalo trails and pack it down, and you can take your skis off and jump in those trails and walk just like they do in them. So there's 2 or 3 different strategies now for wild bison to survive. There's the stay in the park and avoid the hunt, and there's the migrate to lower elevation hunt, looking for the early spring green up and, not wanting to plow through the snow. But then you run the risk of the harvest, once you leave the national park.
If you had to take a wild ass guess, on a bad winter, if no one messed with them, do you think animals would leave the park and then not even come back?
No.
You think they'd go back?
I think they'd go back.
No.
I think you'd see, there's always the exception, right?
Sure.
So you might see a few. But the way animals expand their range, and I didn't finish that story earlier, is that the bulls are the pioneers. And the bulls wander farther because, they're bigger animals. They can't compete with the big crowds of bison that hang out in the big groups. So bulls are going to go out and look for small little pockets of high productivity and just camp on that pocket. Mm-hmm. They might live in a 1 acre patch in the forest of trees, but if it's a marsh, and super productive, they'll do fine feeding themselves for a long period of time if they don't have to compete with anybody else.
Got it.
And so bulls are the much more expected pioneers on how bison would expand their range. And the females are the trackers. They follow footprints, they follow buffalo patties, the whole works, follow the trails that are left behind. And in the 1980s, when the population in the Hayden Valley area grew to, I think it was a little over 2,000 at that point, just in that part of the park, the Firehole Geyser Basin wasn't big enough for them in the wintertime. Mm-hmm. And so they started pioneering down to the west boundary. And we started seeing these rare bull occurrences in West Yellowstone and Horse Butte and places like that.
Yep.
And then there was a couple of big snow years in that decade too. And so it was those big snow years that create, deeper snowpack. And in later years, during those years of deep snowpack, as you start to get longer days, a little bit more warmth, you get a little melting of that snow. Nighttime it gets cold. Bison can't do their thing. Their heads don't dig ice. They only move light, fluffy snow out of the way. In fact, you can see, herds of buffalo walking on top of the snow in February and March sometimes with, significant melt and refreezing. And that's when they simply bail and they walk long distances. Yep. And they follow those trails that the bulls laid down. And they go, okay, the bulls know where they're going. Let's go find those guys, and maybe there's something better at lower elevations. Mm-hmm. So in the mid-1980s, Montana instituted buffalo hunts, and a few animals were harvested by hunters. And it was, it was a good thing for hunters. There was something new to go out and try and harvest. But in the winter following the big fires of 1988, 2 things happened. The fires burned up a lot of that summer forage production. So the animals would dig down through the snow and find black, and it wasn't what they expected. And so there was pretty good sized migrations, both to West Yellowstone and to Gardner. And the hunters couldn't keep up with the harvest. So the game wardens were down there. The Department of Livestock guys were down there enforcing, we don't want any bison out of the park.
Yeah.
And I think that year, it was like 800 animals were killed by hunters, game wardens, DOL agents, and the Park Service rangers even pitched in and helped out.
How many? What was the total population? If they killed 800, how many were there?
That's a good question. I'll have to think. In 1988, I think it was 2,500 or something like that.
Oh, so not a huge
It wasn't
number.
huge.
Oh, because now it'll get to 3 or 4, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where I was telling you that we thought that 2,000 was the sort of number that they'd get to that would sort of drive social capacity of the system to, dig the feeding craters and migrate to the boundary. Well, now, because of 40 years of this aggressive management on the boundary, I think that number is now more like, 3,000 or so on sort of average to slightly above average years. 2 years ago was not even close to that. It was like the storm of the last 3 or 4 decades, I think. And so I would bet that 80% of the population leaves when you have one of those storms of the half century or greater. So that's where society has to decide, well, what is the right number to try and manage for? Because, it's easy to think that you could do it when you have below average, maybe even slightly above average years, where a bunch of animals are leaving. You use hunters to manage distribution. If things got really bad, you'd put some traps in place and catch some animals, much like the park does at Stevens Creek there in the Gardner Basin. The state has a trap they can set up over by West Yellowstone, and they used to, use it a lot when there was more migration that way. So for the last 20 years or 30 years, I think we've tried so many different things that I think we've learned to live with wild bison. And I think that we have the technology, we have the communication skills to get hunters in the right places to harvest animals. And it seems like there's interest by more and more tribes to want to go and harvest bison from the Yellowstone population because they're the remnants of the last wild herds that never were gone from this particular landscape. And so their cultural significance is way above the cultural significance of other herds of bison all across the country. So if a tribal member of the, you name it, different tribe that buffalo are a part of their culture, were to go harvest an animal, going to Yellowstone and doing it is at the top of their list. Going to Fort Peck to do it like you did once upon a time isn't as high on their list as going to Yellowstone, to harvest an animal.
Sure.
So there's a great deal of national significance to preserve, this population because of its, sole remaining wild herd that never evaporated from the system in the history.
Is it
the history of life?
Is it plausible that there's does the tolerant zone have to include major valleys?
You're asking me.
Well, no, okay.
I think the tolerance
from the
zone.
animal. No, I'm saying from the animal's perspective.
Oh, I see what
is
you're
it all
saying.
pointless if it doesn't include the Upper Madison? If it doesn't include the Upper Yellowstone, is it pointless?
I think you're right.
So to
bison,
say okay, anything that's designated wilderness area is now a tolerant zone. They're not going to go there anyway.
in the summer they might,
But they won't stay there. They can't survive the
They'll
winter.
need to go somewhere else. And a few of them, the hardy bulls, the tough guys of the population, they'll figure out how to find a windblown ridge and make it through the winter.
open up more of the landscape, you have to open up the big.
You're going to
valleys.
have to open up like Tom Miner Basin, in the upper part of Paradise Valley, or even down to Immigrant or something like that. You need some grassland kind of areas that have lower elevation, have something.
Or else you're just
for them.
whistling Dixie because you're giving them ground that doesn't matter to them.
Yeah, they're going to go somewhere where there's 6 inches of snow. They're not going to migrate to somewhere where there's 3 feet of snow.
They're not like, let's go to the high country.
Yeah, unless you got hot springs. And that's why the central interior part of Yellowstone saved so many animals is the Firehole Geyser Basin has a bunch of hot springs. Even Hayden Valley has a couple of really cool geyser basins that create a melting phenomena that they can find sedges that are they're green. They're green year round, and that's good stuff for them. And so you'd need places like in Wyoming, you'd want to preserve or identify. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's called Sun something. Just outside the northeast corner of the park, there's a couple high elevation grasslands that might work, and I'll bet prehistorically, bison out of Wyoming would venture all the way up to the high country from that east side and would utilize some of that area as well.
Yeah.
So,
Do you know about the skull I found?
no.
I found a skull over 9,000 feet in the Madisons.
See, I bet that's it probably was a bull, huh?
Yeah, it was a bull.
And
I had it radiocarbon dated.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And it probably was going up there in the summertime because
I can
it
picture
followed the green wave the whole way.
Yeah.
To where the green
Way
wave
up high.
went way up there. And there's some lush, productive, places to graze in that high country area. And there's some places like that in the park where there's some archaeological sites of single animal kills, up around Yellowstone Lake. And I think there's one on the Buffalo Plateau too. I don't remember the archaeological record very well. I used to rely on my colleagues at the park to tell me all those stories of all those cool places that, there's evidence that bison have been in the system for basically the time they migrated to around here from the Siberia. So I think there's room for wild bison on public lands outside the national park. I think society's going to have to make a few concessions, learn how to live with wild bison. I think that it's going to be harder for fish, wildlife, and parks to manage wild bison than it is for them to manage pronghorn and deer. So they're going to have a source of funding to maybe hire a couple of problem solver types.
Fence crews.
The fence crews. Or, my thought is you made a great point earlier when you said we restored grizzly bears and we've restored wolves on the landscape, but we haven't restored wild bison. And the way Fish, Wildlife, and Parks manages grizzly bears and wolves is they have conflict resolution teams.
Yeah.
And there's, folks out of Livingston and Bozeman that work in this area, all in Region 1 and 2. They have a couple different teams over there. A model like that for bison could help Fish, Wildlife, and Parks deal with conflict resolutions where conflicts occur and not just trying to draw what they call a tolerance zone, develop like a true conservation area that they manage bison within. And the staunch conservationists that want 30 million are going to have to recognize that that's an impossible dream.
No,
that is an impossible
that's
dream.
a waste of time talking about that.
A few hundred would be something that the state of Montana could pride themselves in and say, there's not very many places in the world where wild bison can roam on public lands and be managed by a state game agency where, hunters could experience, the same experience that their forefathers 4 or 5 generations ago got to experience by going out and harvesting wild bison. And I think that, and if you've driven around Montana very much, you'll see these signs that say, save the cowboy, eliminate the American prairie or something
save the
like
cowboy,
that.
Stop American Prairie
That's
Reserve.
it. That's it.
Which
Yeah.
even the guy that runs the American Prairie Reserve has acknowledged that it's just a genius campaign.
It's actually
He's like, that's good.
it's somewhat foolish by my perspective because the skills that defined the cowboy, that the romantic cowboy of the historic past, is being able to ride and herd and rope and deal with wild cattle. They could preserve those skills by preserving wild bison. So that in reality, there should be sort of a counter campaign to say, well, you can preserve the cowboy by preserving wild bison, and then you have preserved the skills that, are the more high-end cowboys than the cowboys that ride four-wheelers to manage their cattle herds.
Corinne, can you find what episode number we had? A guest, Sean Garrity, who runs American Prairie Reserve.
Oh yes, he's the CEO. Was that right?
He was on the podcast. If we can find, also, if you can find the Matt Kaufman stuff about migrations.
I was on a flight yesterday coming in.
Episode 148, titled "The American Prairie Reserve." That's one with Sean Garrity. Number 148. And what was the other one?
Matt Kaufman.
Matt Kaufman. We had Kaufman and Kevin Monteith. We recorded it down in Lander.
Landscape of Fear.
Yeah, Landscape of Fear.
Oh, yes.
So American
Episode
Prairie Reserve and Landscape
162.
of Fear gets into a lot of these same issues, but Cal, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just my flight yesterday was full of cowboys. Full of cowboys.
Tell by the hats.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Little kids with hats, people in tracksuits with hats, all converging on the cowboy capital of the world, Big Sky, Montana.
We're not
Stolen
running out of
Thanksgiving.
cowboys and bozemen.
My
Stolen
goodness.
valor.
Man,
Stolen valor.
I was
That's
impressed.
That's right.
I had some thought about what I was going to say about and the American Prairie Reserve is not without its own controversies.
That's right.
And as I recommend that people listen to the episode. There's so much going on there. It's a whole other conversation. But at one hand, it's it's an organization that buys land on the open market.
Yep.
And what they choose to do with the land they buy on the open market is try to restore the Great Plains and try to restore bison. Okay, so there's that end of it. There's another end of it of people looking at a real threat of reduced area to hunt on because a fear that the APR's ultimate objective is to create a national park, which would eliminate a lot of hunting opportunity. It's a really rich subject. But Garrity had an interesting point. Is they're talking about having like 3,000 or 4,000 buffalo. And he was talking about the friction between the APR and the cattle industry in Montana.
Right.
And he was putting it in numbers. He says there are 2 million cows in Montana. Wow. I'm talking about 3,000 buffalo.
Yeah. There's a couple. There's a couple.
It's just this has gotten really lopsided.
Absolutely. There's a couple of things that I really like about APR that have some applicability to the greater Yellowstone area. And one of them is that they've developed a sort of a subsidiary connection to a cattle raising paradigm where they're generating money to pay ranchers to be more tolerant of wildlife on their lands and potentially pay them more for the cost of each pound of beef that they raise. So that, the conscious American citizen that really wants to preserve wildlife and doesn't buy guns and doesn't buy ammunition and doesn't contribute to conservation dollars anywhere else could contribute to conservation dollars by buying beef from those farmers and ranchers that are wildlife friendly.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was someone willing to develop a franchise around here, I bet there's enough committed conservationists that would do the same thing and buy products from a company that's paying farmers and ranchers to live in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and learn to build bigger fences, build a way that during the infection period of brucellosis, they move all their cattle to the high fence area and then preserve, a place for wild animals to move across, 25 or 30% of their property that the cattle don't go to during that sort of critical time period for infection spread. And the other thing about American Prairie is by turning it into some sort of national park, they could generate the kind of rules and regulations. See, national parks are enabled by Congress, and each are unique in their, commitment to what they do for the landscape where they're at. And like Grand Teton National Park, when they established that national park, and there's a handful of them around the system, they preserved hunting in a proportion of the national park. And American Prairie could do the same thing.
I don't think they will.
You don't think they will?
No.
Interesting.
No.
Very
I think they
interesting.
have. I think that they have somewhat of a begrudging relationship with it. That's a personal opinion.
Okay.
I think they have a begrudging relationship.
All
with
right.
it.
We kind of touched a little bit on like the societal tolerance of the hunting and being up there and kind of watching the Gardner scene when it was really going off, right? And
Right.
There's buffalo crap all over the high school football field.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I was just like, well, why not allow a certain amount of tribal hunting within the park boundary? Expand the hunt that way to, a very specific group of people that have the longest relationship with it. They're already, highly regulated. Each tribe, each hunting group has their own game warden with them.
I was talking about this with my kid the other day, and I was saying to him, and I'm not sure on I'm not sure on all the treaty regulations, but I don't know that a lot of the people that signed under the Stevens Treaty, that those tribes wouldn't even be able to make the claim that they could hunt the park if they wanted to.
It came too late for the treaty, or just
I'm saying that people that were under that treaty, there's language in that treaty that I think there's an argument that the tribes could make in the argument that I have every right to hunt the park.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and then there's a handful that would not under the same language, right?
Right.
Because they weren't historically
Yeah.
in that specific area.
Yeah, I think that the thing that prohibits them from going into the national park is that their treaties have a language, and I don't remember it specifically, but it has something to do with claimed versus unclaimed.
Open and unclaimed.
And unclaimed, yeah.
Which
And
there's
park
there's
is
nothing now that's open and unclaimed. So there's like, what does that exactly mean?
And we've determined that it's
I think
federally managed land, not state land, not Montana state land specifically,
And somehow not the park,
and somehow not the
but
park.
it's the national forest.
I
Yes.
think they've determined that the national forest fits that category.
I know, and I would argue, based on no evidence, that so does the park.
Well, it's claimed by Congress as a pleasuring ground for humans. If you look at the enabling legislation of national parks.
Yeah, and it was designated what year? 77 or something like that?
No, 1872.
Was it 72?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think
You
that
don't like that idea.
I don't like that idea.
I can tell.
I don't like that idea because the issue really is if we did it in the boundary lands area, there are some concessions that I think you could figure out how to do it. But what my argument is, if you do it in the national park without, qualifying it, then what's to say it's not justified in Lamar Valley or in Hayden Valley? And I think that hunting disrupts sort of this natural ecology of the system, that it could create chaos, And if you went there to hunt, then they might just scatter to the wind.
I'm only bringing that subject up, and it's like, to me, it's like it's a legal question,
right?
And
right.
I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just saying it's an interesting legal question that at some point in time in the future, a tribe wouldn't say, we're going to go exercise what we understand to be our treaty rights.
Right.
We're going to go exercise them, and if you'd like to arrest us, this is where we'll be on Monday.
Yeah, the Crow Nation probably has the, most opportunity to be successful.
And then they would be in the situation of like, are we really going to go arrest a bunch of crow for hunting?
Right. Well, they've been known to push other, tribal treaty rights kinds of issues. So
I think it'd be a heck of an educational program within the park.
I'd go down there just to watch.
Yeah.
It'd be like when people used to go to watch the Civil War battles, like you'd watch on the sidelines. I'd go down there to watch.
Well,
who's going to win?
The Gardner Basin was an extension, so it's not actually part of the original national park. And I want to say the original national park boundary was, really close to where the arch is in Gardner.
Got it. Yeah.
And at some point in time, there was this program to pay farmers market value for their land because they weren't very productive.
Yeah.
And I don't remember. I think it was in the 1920s or 1930s or something like that.
Again, I'm not advocating for that. What I am advocating is for this, because we're running out of time. I don't know how to do it. I think we need to find. I don't know how to do it. I think we need to find a way to have buffalo on our federally managed public lands.
Public lands.
I don't think it should cost the ranchers money.
I agree.
Like, I don't think it should cost them money. I don't think it should cost them business. I think that we should find a way to do it.
I agree.
And it's like, I just cannot accept that there's not a way to sort this out.
I think there is,
And
but
the money will follow. And I think that sportsmen, like, I think that sportsmen need to, the same way sportsmen demanded bringing back bighorn sheep, the same way sportsmen demanded and funded bringing back elk, in some cases black bears. I mean, all around the country.
Absolutely.
Sportsmen demanded it,
Yep.
paid for it, worked for it. I just don't see why hunters are not saying, let's take a look at this and let's make it be that it doesn't need to cripple the livestock industry. There has to be a way, but I don't know what it is.
I think we need some creative minds from all industries and perspectives to get together and to give them a directive that you have to find a solution. You can't argue, your heartfelt perspective.
Yeah.
So I agree completely. And I don't think it needs to go all the way to Interstate 90, even if that designated brucellosis zone does.
Yeah.
Because then the level of difficulty is dramatically greater.
And maybe the Yellowstone area is not the place to do it.
That's a possibility.
Maybe the place to do it is somewhere in the break. I don't know.
I think American
I need to
Prairie.
fish my word. Maybe it's somewhere to do it in the breaks. But the American Prairie Reserve thing doesn't scratch my itch. That's a private. It's a private enterprise.
It is a private enterprise right now.
Yeah.
But
With
as
their
far as
long-term vision for something
landscapes, right? It's like if we're talking about federally managed lands, then we're talking about either voluntary or some sort of large incentive program to buy out grazing leases that are active. And then the other thing is like landscape fragmentation. Like there's just so many obstacles around the federally managed lands that we have here in Western Montana, which with guarantee if you talk to all the people that were coming off the plane yesterday is like the Wild West. Like it's wide open out here, right? And it's just not, right?
Yep,
so
that's
if we're going to do it, we got to do it fast.
Alaska now has 5. Alaska now has, I think, 5 herds.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah, they got the Copper herd,
Yep.
the Farewell Burn herd, the Delta Junction herd, the Yukon Flats herd.
And at least 1 or 2 of them are the
Chitno.
actual northern buffalo.
1.
1? Okay.
Yeah.
Is hunting allowed?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You can't hunt the wood buffalo one that they just got going, but the intention is to the intention is that you will be able to, and that's how they got local buy-in with Native Alaskans.
Okay.
But all their herds, their source herd was National Bison Range in Montana.
Okay.
And they brought a bunch to Delta Junction and let them trickle out here and there. And now they have these 4, they have 4 managed hunts, and then they have a wood buffalo population. And whether or not wood buffalo are actually different is this whole conversation for geneticists to argue about. But they have this other herd they're establishing there that has the potential to be 3,000-4,000 animals.
Oh wow.
And again, why is that possible? It's possible, like, there's I don't want to insult anyone that has livestock in Alaska. There's effectively not a livestock industry in much of Alaska. They run them as managed hunts. People are very enthusiastic. Like at draw time, everybody fills out their thing to win a chance to hunt. I've done it. My brother Danny, just through his social circle, has gone like 6 or 7 times. Wow. On bison hunts, not just him holding the tag, but buddies of his holding the tag. It's just a part of.
Right.
Yes.
It was brought in as like they're here. They're not necessarily from here. They don't have an adversary. They don't have a human adversary.
That's right.
And they have a lot of public buy-in because the hunts are cool.
Has anyone at this table harvested a bison other than you? Because I know Randall's wife Sydney has a. We're gonna
go up to
APR.
we're gonna go up to the APR in January, and
Very cool.
my wife's got a management tag for that herd.
And then
All right.
Seth, you've had it,
I drew Gardner and West Yellowstone.
but you haven't
But-
harvested.
He didn't
Nope.
have what it takes.
And then Chili's got this.
Didn't
year.
have the snow.
Wait,
We'll see if
which
Chili
one
has
do
what
you
it
have?
takes.
Do you have Gardner or West Yellowstone?
I have Gardner. Yeah,
Okay.
You've got Gardner right
I
now
do.
this winter.
this winter.
All right, let's talk.
All right. Yeah, I was gonna. That's why I've been pretty quiet because I was like, I've already met one guy.
Don't show him your secret
Oh
spot.
my god.
Wait, we should all go along.
Should I be like, can I get in here from the other direction?
Yeah.
No, I've been really quiet because I'm like, there's so much I want to know. Just like because you're very familiar with the area, I'm not. But I've met a guy in Bozeman that's like, yeah, I got the same tag, and I don't want to put it on podcast. So that little guy.
Chili's a veteran too, so give him good special treatment.
I'm a
that
veteran
doesn't
too,
count
so we're
for-
going to get along famously.
Perfect. What branch?
U.S. Army. I'm an
Okay.
artilleryman, so
Okay.
You guys can have that little army
the connection stuff.
Marine Corps.
Marine Corps
yeah,
shit.
I raised a
Semper Fi,
Marine.
Semper
So.
Fi.
Seth and I talk about cowardice a lot. Our shared connection.
Well, you know, there's the brother.
You didn't commit to defend your country either.
We call you guys war dodgers in the industry.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Well, harvesting a wild bison or harvesting any kind of bison gives you the opportunity to teach the next generation a lot of lessons.
yeah.
A lot of lessons. So, I mean, I took my son out to the Green Ranch out on the Madison to harvest a buffalo 20 years ago. We had a grand time. Took us
Oh, I bet.
a long time. But
Yeah, that's why I'm super excited about this hunt because like I grew up in South Dakota and there's a lot of buffalo history there too.
Yep.
And my dad never did it, but he always talked about like buffalo hunts and old timers that he knew going
Yep.
on them. And so I think this is probably the closest thing I'd ever get to doing something like that, you know.
Yep.
And so that's why I'm kind of
And
stoked to do it.
I don't discredit places like the Custer State Park because, you know, it's sort of canned, but again, it provides it's a large enough landscape that it provides the opportunity to experience what our ancestors
Totally.
could have experienced.
When Sydney drew her tag, I texted Dan Flores and I just told him, you know, we're going to be buffalo hunting in January. And his response was like, that's fantastic, Randall. I can't think of a single more historical act that you could do on the Great Plains.
Yep, that's right.
Which I thought
That's
was like
right.
a really funny way of putting it. But I mean, it's hard to argue with it.
Yep.
Rick Wallen, thanks for joining, man. I appreciate it. All your insights.
I admire all you guys. Keep up the good work,
That
and
was very
thanks for the invite.
educational. Yep, thank you.
Thank you.